Well, welcome back to this series on the Communist Manifesto. I have already been told, and I'm not upset about this, but I've been told on one of my previous videos, Was the Early Church Communist, by a self-declared socialist revolutionary, that I am misrepresenting Marxism, and I'm totally willing to entertain the idea that I am misrepresenting Karl Marx. And so, Jacob, if you're watching, I hope you keep your comments on that video for other people to find that critique. So here's what I've done. I've read the Communist Manifesto carefully, took some detailed notes, and went to pro-communist forums when I had questions about what Karl Marx meant. I've watched pro-Marxist videos, and when I was a college pastor at the University of Texas at Austin, spoke with and interacted with communists, self-declared communists, and Marxists. And so I'm totally willing to entertain the idea that I'm misrepresenting Karl Marx with my quotations of the Communist Manifesto and my understanding of it. And yet, at the same time, I believe to be on the same page as very, very many communist revolutionaries. And so it could still be the case that I, along with many, many thousands of Marxists, we together don't understand Marxism. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to lose sleep over that. That's fine with me. So then maybe conceive of this in a different way. I am responding to, as a pastor, with quotations from the Bible, the best I can to the Marxism that I have experienced in my life. In the same way that maybe you would say, somebody is responding to Sunni Islam, and they disagree with Islam, and then a Shia comes along and says, that's not the Islam I know. And you could say, okay, except that this Sunni Islam exists, and it's a force to be reckoned with. So, in that same way, you think, well, maybe my understanding of Marxism is insufficient. That's okay. And I'm willing to grow. But the kind of Marxism I've experienced in the Communist Manifesto itself and in real life have led me to believe that it needs to be responded to because it's common, and I find it to be insufficient and dangerous. And I don't mind saying dangerous. I really do think that. So let's review some of the Communist Manifesto. On page 3, he says, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. And he says, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another. And so what has happened, in my opinion, is devotees of Marxism have adopted this as a worldview, or a lens, if you will, to understand society. He does say, in a word, oppressor and oppressed. And he's summarizing the class struggles. And previously it said the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. So it makes sense to me, whether you agree with it or not, that devotees of Marxism would summarize their understanding of the world in an oppressor versus oppressed matrix. Now this is going to sound really bizarre because Karl Marx didn't believe in morality. He certainly didn't believe in the superficially, hierarchically imposed morality of religion and philosophy. But, as ironic as it sounds, when I've experienced Marxism in today's society, it has adopted a moral matrix of oppression, which is ironic, and yet it still exists as a true phenomenon. So what I mean by a moral matrix of oppression is that there are two classifications of people, by and large: oppressor classes and the oppressed. I guess it would be internally inconsistent if you are a Marxist to believe in a moral framework. And also, at the same time, it's morally insufficient as a moral matrix. So if you don't want to believe in morality, then don't adopt this as a moral matrix. But if you do believe in morality, also don't adopt this as a moral matrix. It's too simplistic. It leaves tons of things out, like virtue. But just in general, overly simplistic worldviews are problems. If you can get woke in like 5 seconds, then you've taken a shortcut to wisdom. And I hope you know by now, wisdom and knowledge are not cheap. It's one of those things where if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If you can get woke in 5 seconds and you understand the inner dynamics of the heart and mind of anybody, just looking at them, just seeing a situation at a superficial way, you feel like you understand the dynamics behind it, then I think that's maybe too woke. You can back off a little bit and see that there's nuance in the world. So here is a small list of things that would be overlooked if there was a moral matrix of just oppression, against the oppressed. So, for example, I can't find a place to put on that spectrum alliances, partnerships, non-financial interpersonal obligations, the honor within an honor-shame culture. It could be a separate debate whether you think honor-shame cultures are good. I think honor's just fine. Loyalty, non-destructive competition. I don't know where to place these on the spectrum of oppressed versus the oppressor. But that's not my biggest critique. My biggest critique is that this spectrum, if you are going to adopt a moral framework, this spectrum is totally insufficient because it leaves out anything positive. If there's oppressors, that's negative. If there's the oppressed, in my opinion, being oppressed is morally neutral. It's not virtuous to be oppressed. And so if this is your spectrum, if these are the extremes of the spectrum, then you just have negative and you have neutral. So here's a thought experiment. If you had to choose between being an oppressor or being oppressed, which would you choose? I'll give you a second to think about this. In other words, if you were going to poke your head into the moral view of oppressed versus the oppressor, which would you choose? Would you rather be morally neutral or morally negative? Would you rather be oppressed or an oppressor? In my opinion, the best available option is to be oppressed. And to be morally neutral is better than being morally negative. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social scientist, but in my opinion, most people I've interacted with want to be good and want to be considered good by their peer group. Like their subset of society that they interact with, they want to be good within that group. So it's not just that you would internally would rather be oppressed than the oppressor, but also you would want people to know that you're not an oppressor, so that at least nobody would think negatively of you. So here's some questions for you. How would you classify the following statements? I want to be strong. Is that oppressive or is that oppressed? Now don't say neither, because this spectrum is actually quite short. And so there's only oppressed and oppressor. How would you classify I want to be strong? How would you classify I want to be the best? I want to be the best in my field. I want to be the best in this sport. I want to be the best on my team. I want to be the best at work. How would you classify I want to be very competent? I want to be useful. I want to own my own land and develop it. I want to grow in wealth. Do any of these things count as oppressed? Obviously not, in my opinion. But if they're not oppressed, and if the only options you have are being oppressed or being an oppressor, then these categories, or these statements, fall right into the category of oppression. All these things I just said are bourgeois things to say. Now I feel insane because Karl Marx was not adopting or even promoting any kind of morality. And yet his devotees, as I've experienced them, are promoting morality, but in a stunted way. So there's so many layers at which this doesn't make sense. Let's make it even simpler and clearer. For the following word pairs, which would be classified as oppressed, which would be classified as oppressive? Strong and weak, rich and poor, powerful, powerless, smart and informed versus uneducated, employer versus employee. If you're forced to ram everything through this moral framework, then strong, rich, powerful, smart, educated, and employer would all count as the oppressive side. Weak, poor, powerless, uneducated, and employee would be the oppressed side. If you have an internal desire to be moral, what goal in your life would count as not oppressive? Would you have a goal of I want to be poor? I want to be harmless? The insanity of this morality matrix, this framework of morality, is that it would, if you really adopted it, which appears to be the case that many have, that you would be making much worse goals for yourself in life. Even if you take capital and set it aside. If you're so obsessed with not wanting to be an oppressor, you might cut back on goals for your life and ambition to be excellent. Because you might think that being dominant in a field or extraordinarily good or talented at something, you might think that that's too oppressive. You should want to be competent. You should want to be wealthy enough to have what you need and a little left over. You should want to be skillful and to have tools that you may not need every day, but that you might need in a pinch. You should want to have resources to share, extra flashlights, extra books, things like this. If you have what you need plus some left over, you're helpful. But if your goal in life is to be harmless, to be non-oppressive, and you would rather be weak than strong because you would rather other people not think of you as an oppressor kind, then you have nothing to offer other people in time of need. The moral aims of a Marxist, which I understand categorically doesn't make sense, but the moral aims would be stunted because of fear. And I do sense a fear of appearing to be oppressive. What would be a worthwhile pursuit? Or would you be like a kulak peasant, burying your possessions so that Soviets don't confiscate it? Would you in that same way, like, hide the fact that you have a little extra from your friends so they don't take it, or so that they don't become jealous, or so that they don't think you're one of the oppressor classes? Within this framework, what would be a worthwhile moral pursuit? You say, Matt, again, Karl Marx isn't promoting morality. I know, but I believe in morality, and many billions of other people do also. And, ironically, devotees of Marxism seem to believe in morality, whether they should or shouldn't, based on their own framework. But what would be a worthwhile moral pursuit? Being an equalizer? Perhaps being a liberator? How would you justify being successful? Having money left over, having things left over, even if you took out capital, having what you need plus a little extra to take care of people like your family or your friends or your neighbors. Ecclesiastes chapter 10 says in verse 19, "A feast was made for laughter, wine makes life merry, and money is the answer for everything." Now, I wouldn't want you to take that very literally. Wine doesn't always make people happy. A feast doesn't always make people laugh. And money can't literally solve every problem in every way, but it answers all things. I think that's what the King James says. It answereth all things. So here's a strange little example. Let's say a tornado destroys everything that belongs to a friend of yours down the road 4 or 5 miles, and they show up at your door and they say, "Brother, we've got nothing. We have nothing. The tornado took all of our clothes, all of our stuff, our phones, our chargers. We just have what was in our pockets and the shirts and stuff on our back." And you say to them, "Well, you can sleep on the floor of my house. You could sleep next to me on the floor. We could all share a mattress or something. But I have nothing extra to give you because it's been a life goal of mine to not be an oppressor. So I'd rather be the oppressed kind, and I want to just barely get by. So I've got nothing to help you with." That's not very nice. So it seems like what the Bible's saying here actually does make sense. Would you rather have a vault full of clothes or just extra cash? If you have a vault full of clothes of all sizes, they could go in and choose, but that would be more wasteful than just having extra cash to give to your friend. So you could have extra flashlights, extra books, extra blankets. You could have an extra car that works. You could donate things to them. If you have a problem and you don't have the exact tool, and you don't have the exact clothes for somebody, you don't have the exact blanket that will fit their bed, or you don't have an extra bed, but that's what they need, but you have money left over, you're helpful. It's helpful to be successful. It's helpful to have an extra padding of wealth or knowledge, resource, any kind of resource. It's helpful to have extra resources. And it's helpful on the front end to aim for that, to on purpose in life try to be successful so that you have what you need and more. There may be other things to say in this, and I understand that this is too simplistic, but this may be a good plug for the Bible. In the Bible's understanding of human nature, you are not in a class, either oppressor versus the oppressed. All humans have suffer from the problem of evil, and the Bible speaks to that problem in a much more nuanced way than you're either an oppressor or the oppressed. We all have a fight against evil, and the true rescue from that is not being harmless and not oppressing other people, but the true rescue from sin is in the power of Jesus Christ and in the Holy Spirit, restoring us, giving us new life and new birth, so that we would become children of God truly by His Spirit. But even outside of this rebirth motif that Jesus taught about, the Bible talks about how sin crouches, that it seeks to entrap us, and that every person needs to fight against sin and temptation and resist temptation and flee from it. The division between dark and light runs right in the middle of the heart of every man, woman, and child. So to paint with broad brushes, like, well, that's an oppressor, that's the oppressed, that's an oppressor, that's the oppressed. is too simplistic, and even sophisticated Marxists would agree with me. That's too simplistic. But I think it's so simplistic that it's dangerous. The Bible says we battle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. People are not my enemy. So even if somebody's oppressing, that person, according to the Bible, should not be classified as the enemy. There's spiritual forces at work. There's darkness, there's wickedness, evil, and sin. That is our enemy. And I think the Bible has a much more nuanced view of the human heart. I recommend you reading the Bible. But even if you do or don't, think more critically about whether you do or do not have a moral framework for the way you understand the world. If you don't want to have any kind of morality, there's no morality, true Marxist lack of morality, then please don't be the self-appointed vanguards against oppression. But if you do believe in morality, adopt a moral framework that's much more nuanced and is expanded to include positive virtues. I hope this extra contribution to the conversation is helpful to you. Leave a like if you liked, share if you think it's helpful, leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.